More than 1,000 years ago, a small wooden ship cut through the cold waves of the Atlantic Ocean. At its bow was a carved dragon's head, and on the deck stood several dozen men wrapped in woolen cloaks soaked with salt water. The wind tore at the sail, waves slammed against the hull, and around them stretched nothing but the endless grey sea. The people on that ship did not know exactly where they were going. They were simply sailing west, farther than anyone from their people had ever gone before. Among them stood a man named Leif Erikson. He watched the horizon carefully, and through the fog a dark line slowly began to appear. It was land no European had ever seen before. As the ship approached the shore, the crew saw something astonishing. Dense forests stretched along the coastline, rivers flowed into the ocean, and green hills rose above the shore. For men who had grown up among cold cliffs and ice, the sight looked almost unreal. They stepped onto the wet sand and realized they had discovered a new land. They called it Vinland, the land of wine. But at that moment they did not yet know that their story there would be short. To understand how these men reached another continent 500 years before Christopher Columbus, we must go back in time to a world where the ocean marked the edge of the unknown and exile could change the course of history. Leif's father, the famous explorer Eric the Red, had been banished from Iceland after a violent conflict. In those days, exile meant losing everything: your home, your land, and your protection. But instead of disappearing, Eric did what many Vikings did. He sailed farther west. After crossing the cold waters of the North Atlantic, he reached a huge island and named it Greenland. The name sounded inviting, but reality was far harsher. Most of the island was covered in ice, summers were short, winters were long and brutal, and survival depended on fishing, hunting, and stubborn determination. The settlers in Greenland soon faced a serious problem. The island had almost no forests, and wood was essential for Norse life. Ships, houses, tools, and weapons all required timber. Without it, the colony could not survive for long. That is why any story about lands to the west immediately attracted attention. One day, such a story appeared. A sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson was sailing to Greenland when a powerful storm pushed his ship far off course. For several days, the vessel drifted through thick fog. Then suddenly the mist cleared, and in front of them appeared land covered with dark forests. It was not Greenland and not Iceland, but Bjarni did not land there. Instead, he turned his ship and continued toward Greenland. When he later told the settlers about what he had seen, the story quickly spread and became almost legendary. One man, however, decided to test whether the story was true. That man was Leif Erikson. He bought Bjarni's ship and prepared an expedition to search for the mysterious western land. Around the year 1000, he gathered about 35 men and set sail across the Atlantic. The journey was dangerous because Viking sailors had no compasses and no detailed maps. They navigated using the sun, the stars, the direction of the wind, and even the behavior of birds. If seagulls appeared, it often meant land was nearby. After days of sailing, they finally saw a rocky coastline. The Vikings called this place Helgeland, meaning the land of flat stones. Today, historians believe it was Baffin Island, but Leif did not stay there and continued sailing south along the coast. Soon the landscape changed completely. Thick forests covered the land, something the settlers of Greenland desperately needed. The Vikings called this region Markland, forest land. It could have become a valuable source of timber, but Leif wanted to explore farther. Sailing south again, his crew eventually reached a land that seemed warmer and richer than anything they had seen before. Rivers were full of fish, forests were filled with animals, and the land looked fertile. According to Norse sagas, the sailors even found wild berries that they believed were grapes. That is how the land received its name, Vinland. Leif and his crew decided to stay there for the winter. They built several longhouses using wood and turf, just as they had done in Iceland and Greenland. Their small settlements stood near the shore, and their ships were pulled onto land for repairs. The men hunted, fished, and explored the forests around them. For settlers who had come from the harsh environment of Greenland, the land seemed almost perfect. But soon they noticed something strange. Near a river, they saw footprints in the sand. Not the tracks of animals, but human footprints. At that moment, the Vikings realized something they had not expected. This land was not empty. It already had people living on it. In the days that followed, the settlers began noticing more signs that they were not alone. Footprints appeared again and again along the rivers and beaches. They found the remains of campfires, and sometimes they heard strange sounds from forest, branches snapping or grass moving as if someone were watching from the shadows. Leif's men understood that other people lived somewhere nearby, but they did not know who they were. In the Norse sagas, these people were called skrælings, a word that roughly meant foreigners or people who speak strangely. Modern historians believe they may have been ancestors of the Beothic or possibly related to early groups of Inuit who had lived in those regions for thousands of years. The first meeting happened unexpectedly. One morning, several Vikings saw a group of people standing on the shore, looking at their ships. They wore animal skins and carried long spears. The two groups stared at each other in silence because neither side understood the other's language. Surprisingly, the first contact was peaceful. The Vikings showed they were not attacking and brought items for trade: pieces of cloth, metal knives, and dairy products. For the local people, metal was extremely valuable. In exchange, they offered furs, hides, and meat. The trading method was simple. One group would place goods on the ground and step back, allowing the other group to approach and do the same. For a moment, it seemed that peaceful coexistence might be possible. But the two cultures were very different. The Vikings were sailors and warriors whose society valued strength, honor, and conquest. Many of them had spent their lives fighting in raids or battles across Europe. For them, discovering a new land meant the possibility of building settlements and claiming its resources. For the indigenous people, the situation looked completely different. Strangers had suddenly appeared on their coast in enormous ships, carrying metal weapons and unfamiliar animals. Even though the first meetings were peaceful, mistrust remained. Eventually, something happened that changed everything. During one trading visit, a large bull was tied near the Viking camp. For the Norse, it was simply a farm animal, but for people who had never seen such a creature before, it looked terrifying. When the bull suddenly roared and lunged forward, the visitors panicked and ran away. After that incident, they did not return for a long time. And when they finally did come back, the atmosphere had changed. This time, they did not arrive as traders. They arrived as warriors. Large groups of Skraelings appeared carrying bows, spears, and slings that could launch stones with great force. The Vikings prepared themselves as well, raising their shields and gripping axes and swords. But there were only a few dozen of them. The first clash was quick and violent. Arrows flew from the forest while stones struck shields and buildings. The Vikings fought back with heavy weapons and shield walls, which made them deadly in close combat. Yet the local warriors fought differently. They attacked from a distance and then disappeared back into the forest, only to appear again somewhere else. For such a small colony, this kind of fighting was extremely dangerous. Month after month, the attacks became more frequent. Sometimes arrows suddenly appeared from the dark forest. Sometimes small groups of warriors approached the settlement and vanished just as quickly. The Vikings might have been stronger in direct combat, but they were far too few to control an entire region. Gradually, the settlers realized a frightening truth. Vinland was rich and beautiful, but it was not empty. And the people who had lived there for generations were ready to fight for their land. What had begun as peaceful trade between two cultures was slowly turning into war, a war that the small Viking colony might not be able to win. After the first clashes, life in Vinland was never the same. The settlement that had once looked like a hopeful beginning now felt more like a fortified outpost on the edge of a hostile world. Vikings no longer walked into the forest alone. Hunting parties carried weapons, and every trip outside the settlement was treated as a risk. People constantly watched the dark line of the forest where the trees stood thick and silent. Somewhere beyond them lived the warriors who had already begun testing the strength of the newcomers. The Norse were experienced fighters, but the situation here was different from the wars they had known in Europe. In Europe, they fought armies, cities, and kings. In Vinland, the enemy was invisible, appearing suddenly and disappearing just as quickly into forests and valleys that only they understood. According to the Norse sagas, new expeditions eventually arrived in Vinland. The most famous was led by the explorer and merchant Thorfinn Karlsefni. Unlike Leif's first expedition, Karlsefni brought a much larger group of settlers, including women and children. This suggested that the Norse still believed Vinland could become a permanent colony. Karlsefni hoped to establish a stable settlement that could supply valuable resources to Greenland, especially timber. At first, things looked promising. New houses were built, trees were cut for construction, and the settlers hunted and explored the surrounding land. During this time, a child named Snorri, Karlsefni's son, was born in the colony. According to the sagas, he became the first European child born in North America. But even with more settlers, Vinland remained dangerously vulnerable. The colony was still small and far away from help, and the local peoples had not forgotten the strangers who had arrived on their shores. One day, groups of Skraelings appeared again near the settlement. At first, they stood at a distance and observed the Norse camp. But each day, their numbers grew. Soon they began gathering in larger groups, carrying bows, spears, and slings. The settlers understood what was coming. The tension that had been building for months was about to explode. Then the large attack came. According to the sagas, One morning, a large group of warriors approached the colony. They were far more numerous than the Vikings themselves. Arrows began raining toward the settlement, while stones from slings struck shields and buildings with tremendous force. The Vikings formed a shield wall, standing shoulder to shoulder with their round shields raised. In close combat, they were extremely dangerous. Their axes and swords were heavy and deadly, but their enemies did not rush forward. Instead, they kept their distance, firing arrows and retreating back into the forest whenever the Vikings tried to advance. Then they would reappear somewhere else and attack again. This style of fighting exhausted the defenders. One strange story from the sagas became legendary. During one of these attacks, a woman named Freydis, said to be related to Leif Erikson, saw some of the Vikings beginning to retreat in fear. According to the story, she grabbed a sword, struck the blade against her chest, and screamed at the attackers to frighten them. Whether the story is fully true or not, it reflects the chaos and desperation inside the colony. After several clashes like this, the settlers realized something unavoidable. Even if they could win individual battles, they could not win the larger struggle. They were too few, too isolated, and too far from help. Vinland was rich and promising, but it was not theirs to take. Eventually, the Norse leaders made a difficult decision. The colony would be abandoned. The ships were prepared again, supplies were gathered, and tools and weapons were packed. The houses they had built remained standing near the shore, silent reminders of an ambitious dream. Smoke from the last fires rose into the cold sky as the ships were pushed back into the water. One by one, they sailed away from Vinland and turned east, back toward Greenland. The first European colony in North America had lasted only a few years. After the Vikings left, Vinland slowly disappeared from memory. Stories about the Western land survived in the Icelandic sagas, passed down through generations of storytellers. Sailors spoke of distant shores with forests and rivers, of strange encounters with unknown peoples, and of a colony that had once stood across the ocean. But over time, these stories began to sound more like legends than real history. Europe was changing. Trade networks expanded, kingdoms grew stronger, and attention shifted toward the south and east. The remote Norse colonies in Greenland gradually weakened as well. Harsh climate, isolation, and limited resources made life there increasingly difficult. By the 15th century, the Greenland settlements themselves had vanished, and with them most of the living memory of Vinland. For centuries, the story remained hidden inside ancient texts. Many historians believed the sagas were only myths or exaggerated tales of exploration. Without physical evidence, the idea that Vikings had reached North America seemed doubtful. Meanwhile, the voyages of Christopher Columbus in 1492 reshaped world history. His journey marked the beginning of the Great Age of Exploration, when European empires began expanding across the oceans. Because of this, Columbus's name became forever linked with the discovery of America. Yet the Old Norse stories never completely disappeared. In the 20th century, researchers began to look at them more seriously. In 1960, Norwegian explorer Helger Ingstad and archaeologist Stein Ingstad traveled to the northern coast of Newfoundland searching for clues that might match the descriptions in the sagas. After speaking with local residents and studying the coastline, they discovered something remarkable. Beneath grassy mounds were the remains of ancient buildings made from turf and wood. When archaeologists began excavating the site, they found unmistakable Norse artifacts, ironworking tools, rivets from ships, and the layout of longhouses identical to those used by Vikings in Iceland and Greenland. The site became known as Lance Auxiliary Meadows, and it changed how historians understood the past. The discovery proved that Vikings had indeed reached North America around the year 1000, 5 centuries before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. The sagas were not merely legends, they were echoes of real events. Yet the story of Vinland also reveals something deeper about history. Being first does not always mean being remembered. The Vikings reached the shores of America long before other Europeans, but they did not remain there. Their colony was too small and too far from home. They had no empire behind them, no steady supply of settlers, and no way to control the vast lands around them. Meanwhile, the indigenous peoples who already lived there knew the terrain, the climate, and the resources far better than any outsiders. In the end, the Norse voyages to Vinland became a brief chapter in a much larger story. A bold experiment that happened centuries before the world was ready for it. And yet it remains one of the most remarkable journeys of the medieval world. A handful of sailors in wooden ships managed to cross the Atlantic Ocean and reach a new continent, guided only by wind, stars, and courage. They did not stay, but they proved that the ocean could be crossed, and that long before the Age of Empires, Viking explorers had already sailed into the unknown and reached the shores of a new world.